This is The Wilderness and the Wellspring, a podcast about the difficult times when you want to give up on your creative pursuits and the beauty of the act of creation. I'm your host, Jeff Lunt. This is episode 17, my interview with John Schloman about life, art, and electronics. Welcome back to The Wilderness and the Wellspring. Today I'm joined by a good friend of mine, John Schloman. He and I used to work together a number of years ago. We've remained friends afterwards, and he's got this great creative life in addition to his career, where he is into music in ways I could only aspire to, knows crap tons of things about every band I've ever heard of and a bunch I haven't, paints on the side, and also builds his own electronics. So welcome to the show, John.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jeff. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So we met a few years ago, 2016, I think, right?
Yes. Both working at Nova Financial. We were both lead engineers there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we kind of came in, and then I think you sort of stayed on the IC path of things, individual contributor, actually keeping your fingers on the keyboard, actually generating things, while I went off on the management path, which, I don't know, as an engineer, I think has benefits, making engineers' lives better. And like there is a satisfaction that you can get out of that. But also there is that quality too of at the end of a week, at the end of even a year or whatever, you're like, what did I actually personally accomplish here? Sometimes it just feels like you don't want to be a pointy-haired boss, right? Or something, or just, then I attended all these meetings and hopefully people actually made useful things. So anyway, creativity helps with that.
So the day you told me you wanted to be a pointy-haired boss, that was a facade?
Yeah, exactly, right? Then, a mirage that I throw up a smokescreen.
Okay. Yeah, never know what's going on with you, because you're the man of mystery.
Really? Okay. I didn't realize I was that mysterious, but...
Well, you're eclectic, I'll say. Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
That's true. I do come out from a family of academics. Both of my parents are PhDs. My dad's chemist, my mom in library sciences and things like that. But art was always a big part of us growing up. And even to the point where thinking about how you would talk about going on family trips, what would you do? And so for our family, a classic thing would be like, okay, well, you'd go there, you'd go to museums, you'd probably go to an art museum, you'd go out and have good meals. And then one thing that we didn't do is that a lot of people would do is like go shopping, right? So attending art, my dad would take us to, when you go to Broadway, you go to Broadway shows. And when you're in New York, you would go to the opera. You would see things like the Nutcracker Suite around Christmas. And only later on did I realize that was kind of a abnormal sort of experience a bit. You get into music. Probably one thing when it came into music, then my brother was a bigger influence on me. He's 6 years older than me. So he'd come back from college with all of these albums. He'd make mixtapes and those sorts of things. And at some point you sort of realize that your interests are not exactly what your friends are, that there is hopefully a Venn diagram and there is that union at the middle, or I guess the intersection. But at some point you're like, listen, I have these interests that are sort of on my own. I'm outside of these sort of things. And so you kind of keep sort of a separation of church and state, because you have that recognition too, that while you might be a part of these smaller communities, say like you could be really into punk rock, or you could be into fine art and things like that. When you're in high school, obviously that's a perfect place for you to get judged for things. But then also those communities also have a bad habit of turning that around too, and being very gatekeepy and very obnoxious to be around. And I only realized later on, I was like, okay, this isn't necessarily behavior that other people appreciate. I don't want to force my interests onto other people. So that's one reason why I just sometimes like, hey, I'm into this thing. Or the people ask you, it's like, what did you do this weekend? It's like, well, I actually went out to LA for the second time to go to this, music festival, because I wanted to go and see the Human League. Because the first time I saw them last May, the whole festival got canceled right in the middle of their set, and we all got kicked out of the Rose Bowl, right? And so you're like, okay, well, and then most people are like, wait a minute, you traveled across the country to go to a concert. It's like, well, yes, I did. And you kind of mentioned all these weird things. You don't realize that they're weird until people sort of point them out to you.
Did the number of concerts... Are you talking about like the number of shows you go see, or the lengths you would go to, for example?
Yeah. I mean, I've been to concerts outside of the country, and I've intentionally done that. There have been concerts outside of the country that I'm like, wow, I wish I would have done that. Traveling to other cities. I've always used music and art museums as a great way of kind of setting anchors within a city and saying, I will go there and then look around those neighborhoods as actually places to go to. Not necessarily going to the big sites and everything. When you go to London, for me, it was something where it's like, well, I want to go to Brixton because that's where a lot of Black British culture came from. Electric Avenue is there. Literally, the Eddie Grant song and everything that people of our generation remember. And for most people, it would just seem to be an odd destination, but I don't know, that's the sort of thing. It's like a great sort of way to great way to build your vacations around that type of stuff. So whenever my wife mentions something, or I have to go to some place for work, or my friends talk about things, or even then we intentionally say, this band is only coming to the US, they're doing an LA and a New York show. Well, let's go to New York and then pile on a couple of other things on top of that.
And did you have a lot of friends that were into that as soon as you had the means to like have a car and go do that stuff? Or was that a group you found later in life?
That was definitely something I found later in life.
Were you going to a lot of shows on your own before that? Not
really. When I was in high school, I did. It was something where I grew up in the Cleveland area, that there were a lot of classic venues. You kind of come up with a sort of cohort of folks. And so going to the music venues up there, the art movie theaters, the art museums and things like that, I kind of had that group. When you sort of then move on to the next parts of your life, when I was in college, and then I spent 9 years in the DC area, the opportunity, the social aspect of it wasn't there. And the social aspect really does help when it comes to creative things, right? You have people to bounce ideas off of, to provide positive feedback in an informed way. It can be very, very difficult if you're just, sitting out in the middle of Maryland to say, I need to, after a long day of work, turn around and then go grab a bunch of art supplies and go all the way over to Alexandria, Virginia and do a painting class, which I did for a while, spending 2 hours driving each way, which is definitely a big buy-in thing. Going all the way down to U Street to go and see a show randomly by yourself and standing there by yourself with your arms crossed, nodding your head. And it's like, yeah, that was great. And then walking off and not talking to anybody, right? Like you're Morrissey or something.
Yeah. Okay. So when did you start making friends at the shows? Like how did you wind up eventually finding that community around music that you liked?
So actually going out and participating was a very crucial thing. I met my wife at a concert, and that, we were the two tall people standing in the back, and she worked very, very hard and did all the work and picked me up. And, we started dating, and we got married, and going to music is a big part of our lives. I've met some friends just randomly at concerts. One of my best concert friends, this fellow Dwayne, he's an Australian, lived in New York, moved to Chicago randomly. He saw I was wearing a Bruce Springsteen t-shirt at an LA Witch show. And so he's like, this guy must be an interesting dude to do that. And so we just started chatting. And I realized one aspect of my life that I hadn't really developed was just that innate ability to have a cordial peer-to-peer conversation with a stranger, right? I may never see this person again. I have no transaction with them, but we are both here at this moment doing more than just the bare minimum of communicating to someone, because you never know where it's going to go. I went and saw the movie Zone of Interest this last weekend with a friend of mine. After we saw it, this guy came up to me and he said, "What did you think of this movie?" I'm like, it was very interesting. It was strangely designed in a very weird way. And he was like, yeah, I don't know what I thought about it. It's like, well, you know who the director is? He's like, no, I don't. And it was like, okay, well, it's Jonathan Glazer. He's this British music director who makes all of these very strange movies. He made that movie, what's the Scarlett Johansson movie, where she plays the alien and has this real, where they are harvesting people. And it's this.
I don't think I've seen that one. No.
Yeah, it begins with, it's not Out of Sight. I can't remember the name of it, but it has this very abstract artistic way of how she captures the humans and then they get turned into something. I had actually read the book. My father had given it to me. My father is huge into science fiction. And it sort of has this Jonathan Swifty quality, but from the perspective of aliens who are harvesting people. And the movie does this major divergence. So it's like, I know all of these, it's once you start making connections in culture, you sort of realize it. But talking to this person, he's like, came up to me and he asked me, I was like, well, I started having a conversation with him. Didn't get his name. Didn't really talk too long, but he wanted to talk to somebody about this film. And I realized that the social quality of art is often in that communication. Art isn't made in a vacuum. What it was that Marc Chagall said, art begins where reality ends. There very much is a quality of where society is now. Artists are trying to sort of on the umbra of that, right? They're at the edge trying to find where things are going to be next a little bit. And so that's a communication. That's a conversation you're having with the larger society, with your peers and all that type of thing.
So you mentioned realizing that, you weren't great at just like striking up conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Like, did that flip at some point? You also mentioned you met your wife at the concert, but she did all the work, as you said.
Oh, yeah.
so you're happy to just go along?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things, too, where my general assumption is, and again, that comes down from all these types of artistic expression, that forcing conversation on people who don't want to have it, forcing your presence upon people where they just suddenly realize you're like, we're just here to have a good time. We're not here to actually looking to talk. I would sort of step back, be a little more passive on things. And so obviously my wife is much stronger personality than I am and things like that. And, I'm grateful for being that way because otherwise we wouldn't be together, right? I mean, so having that, was one big thing. But then I have my friend Mark Hurst, who I met through friends here, is a major consumer of music the same way I am. So we're sort of kindred spirits. But he has the ability to talk to anyone cold at any time. He describes it as something that he picked up because he moved around a lot as a kid. So he's like, this is a skill he has developed and like his natural thing. I remember one time going to a show at the Chicago Theater. He's having this deep conversation with these two fellows there. And he's like, okay, well, I'll see you guys later. And I was like, who are those guys? And like, I don't know. I was just standing here. I saw these two guys. So I just started talking to them. And I realized that we're not looking for everyone to become our friends, but there are all these grades of interactions with people between that, right? And friendship often can sometimes grow out of that too. And even then it's just worthwhile to, you make a space welcoming for everyone, right? Suddenly everybody feels that they have a voice where it's kind of like the Cheers thing, right? You open the door, everybody like says, hey, Norm, how's it going, right? And it's like, can we get you something to drink? Do you want to sit at the bar? Can I get you a food menu, right? All you need is a little bit of that and that, it can go such a long way. And I really learned that from him. And I realized that was a great opportunity to grow as a person, right? So,
does that have anything to do with your choice to focus on management in your career?
That's a good question. Focusing on management, a part of that came out of an ability or a desire to just allow engineers to work. Sometimes I think that engineers, where it's like, listen, if you can give us clarity, if you can define the sandbox, they can build anything in it. But you need to tell them where the sandbox is, right? Like you just can't give them the entire Sahara and then just have them wandering around, like, picking away at things. And so for me, I love the idea. It's like, listen, if I can just do this work, I've worked with some phenomenal engineers who are brilliant about certain types of code bases, certain types of architectures, certain businesses, and to unleash them and get the full potential out of them, like you can just get them to run if you just have good management about it. So that was the thing that attracted me to it. This second thing about the sort of social quality of it, I realized this later, and actually I have applied it, where engineers sometimes, I think that a lot of us get into engineering because you're like, this is something I can fully control by myself as an individual. I can learn all of this by myself, and I can create something as a team of one. And that is incredibly empowering, right? Where it's like, I don't need to have like larger team sports skill sets or whatever. But for me, I've always thought that engineering is a team activity. Programming is an individual activity. And so to actually truly do software engineering, I did realize that it's like you have to work those communication channels. And everybody's different. You have to find different ways of doing that. But one thing I said, like going back to Mark, is if you can make people feel welcome, that there's a seat at the table for them, even if they decide where it's like, hey, listen, I'm going to go and, stand in front of the TV and, eat my meal while, the movie's on or whatever it is, like, that's fine. But there's a seat at the table here for you, right? And just, even just knowing that, I think really can help a team to coalesce.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things you said. One, like the allure of engineering for a lot of people, I think me included, was at least in part the idea that you could get skilled enough to make a thing, right? The beauty of sort of creating something and the fun of it and the joy of it, and be like, oh, I had an idea and I translate it into a thing that gets up and moves around, or there's something really exciting about that. And yet programming itself is also so detailed oriented that I think it appeals to people wanting to care about every detail and put their mark on it, and not just write code for business purposes, but to feel like it's kind of an expression of their creativity in some ways.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one thing I like about electronics, right, is that if you make a mistake in terms of building a circuit or, misplacing something on a circuit board, it doesn't work. Like physics will win an argument against you every time, right? Like the electrons are going to do what electrons need to do. They're going to follow the laws. All of these things have been pretty well figured out, right? There isn't just like, well, I'm going to kind of break Ohm's law here just for you, so this will work this way, right? So there is that quality where it just is diligent. Even just doing like a good solder connection, right? It's like a good solder, a good like bend of a wire. Like it's just very satisfying to have it go along, right? And there definitely is that quality where it's like you do that and it's like, I have sort of mastered some fundamental thing that a lot of people kind of gloss over.
Mm-hmm. I've had an experience I think is similar to what you're describing with one of my sort of creative things I've done here and there is woodworking. And I used to intermix it with other things like writing programs or photography or whatever. I would mix it as kind of, I don't know, a break from heavy like mental creativity where you're sitting at a desk working through a problem or hyper focused, doing a composition and a photograph or something like that. The physicality of it, I thought was also interesting. You're talking about like the satisfaction of a good solder connection, bending the wire and probably like laying things out visually in an appealing way that also works. And yeah, I always really enjoyed that as these different facets of these different creative pursuits, how they satisfy different aesthetic needs, different, you feel accomplished when you like have a big idea, break into a bunch of pieces and they all come together and the thing comes out at least approximately the way you thought it would.
Oh yeah. Well, and then even sometimes too, where you accidentally find yourself in a corner and then you have to problem solve your way out of it too, right? Where there is that quality of like, listen, sometimes there's nothing better than getting a nice, IC connector. And it's like, okay, I've got to do like 20 solders in a row. And you're just like, right? And you just have that good thing of, watching the solder boil, like the flux working, it liquefies. And then once you take the heat off of it, you can just sort of see it pop and like solidify and everything like that as, the temperature, you just like, hits a threshold. It's just something very...
Is it like perfectly filling out a Scantron bubble?
Yeah, heck, I would even say it's like almost like popping like...
Bubble pack?
Oh yeah, bubble pack. Yeah. It's just like there's something just very, like if you can get like just a nice rhythm to it, there's an aesthetic quality to it that is so satisfying. But then sometimes you get into those corners where you're like, wait a minute, like examples like I have an enclosure, I'm trying to fit this in here. This actually doesn't fit. Okay, how do I get all of this to work in there? How do I have to need to take some things off? Do I need to change a dial and stuff like that? And so you can work your way out of that a bit. And then if you can get it to work, it's like, yes, right? Yeah. I'm able to do the monotonous quality of things, but then suddenly when I hit some sort of barrier, I'm able to work my way through it through mastery of a skill.
Through the sort of the creative problem solving and like applying what you've learned in new and novel ways to like solve problems you didn't necessarily read out of a book, right?
Yeah, definitely, right?
So speaking about electronics in particular, what's your general approach? Like what's the thing you brought with you? There's no camera, by the way, so you have to describe it.
So this is a small black enclosure with 3 potentiometers on it and an on-off switch, and you can't see it. It has actually a speaker in the middle here. Inside of this is a Atari Punk console. So this is a classic circuit. It was originally designed by Forrest M. Mims III in 1980, and it was actually came in a Radio Shack catalog. And so it is a very classic, basic oscillator.
So it's about the size of like a effects pedal, like for a guitar or something.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And so it uses 2 ICs in it, 2 555 chips. This one is actually built with the 556, which is basically 2 555 chips together. And it's so simple that, I'm pretty sure that there are people who can probably draw it out of memory in terms of what's going on and things like that. And so, I don't know, he built it and you can get all sorts of kits for it. You can make them yourselves. There are all of these examples of it. And for me, that's just like kind of the perfect sort of thing where it's like I bought this and I put it together. And then I was like, well, I want to put it into an enclosure. And so I problem solved it by jamming it into this enclosure. And then I'm like, well, I'm going to, since it's the Atari Punk console, I'm going to put like a very punk rock sort of, drawing on it and stuff like that. Yeah. I mean, and actually I've made even guitar pedals as well too for friends based upon kits and stuff. But I don't know, like sometimes you have pre-built kits that you can use, which are a lot of fun. There's some great, very small companies that make this stuff all across the world. There are a lot of folks who build these where you can sort of get PCBs made for you on demand based upon their designs, and you can buy those and then build them yourselves based upon their component lists.
So everything from off the shelf to learn it yourself, pick the components, all that thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
What would you use this for, by the way?
I don't know.
What does it do? You say it's an oscillator. Like, what sorts of things would you use an oscillator for?
So an oscillator, the nice thing with an oscillator is that you can get, you basically get an oscillator can potentially generate, square waves. triangle waves, saw waves. But then once you start applying various sorts of resistors and capacitors to them, you start creating high pass and low pass filters. And suddenly you get these smooth analog signals. And based upon what you do to them, you can slowly start modifying those waves to represent different sounds that we have. So you could look at them in an oscilloscope, or you can actually run them through a speaker, and then suddenly you actually hear what the sound of a literal electronic wave sounds like.
And so when you say electronic waves, you're talking about voltage and amperage going up and down at different rates. That's what these different shapes you're talking about are.
Yeah.
And then you plug that into, say, an amp or something, or a speaker of some sort, and that's just what it sounds like if I have this right. It's been a long time since I did any electronics. I'm trying to think of a good analogy. But anyway, it's just what that sounds like when you pump that current through this circuit and connect it to an audio device, basically. Right? Like a speaker is a thing that vibrates at certain frequencies, and higher frequency has a higher sound and lower frequency has a bass sound, and that's all there is to it pretty much.
Yeah. And I know the idea is that I find it, again, we were talking about sort of the satisfaction of building things. Getting a sound out of something is like so viscerally satisfying. And I remember somebody describing like the first sense was taste, right? It's literally a cell capturing either smaller cells or things coming inside of it, and that consumption of it was like the first sense. And so probably taste, then probably smell, then probably sound was the next one, right? It was some sort of, there was a medium, probably, we're all in water or something, right? And, those waves transmitted between things, all it is just that it's a bioelectric chemical signal from somebody else producing a sound, going through some medium, hitting something like a microphone or, an ear, and then getting turned back into a biomechanical sound, chemical sound again. And then, that suddenly you hear it. And I don't know, there's just something very, very cool about that versus, I don't know, sometimes people like it because you can get lights and those sort of things. But yeah, for me, sound is, I don't know, where it's at, I guess.
Well, and to describe it that way, it's like you're breaking it down to its most fundamental level. And in addition to what you're talking about with the satisfaction of getting that to work, there's a thing, this applies to engineering too, is the joy of sort of like the light bulb moment coming on. You're like, oh, this thing that I thought was like magical, or like I didn't know how it worked, somebody explained it to you, or you found a resource, you read about it, you just played with it, and you break it down into its parts, and then you see how it works, and you're just like, oh, that's kind of beautiful how simple it is. But then the joy of then being able to leverage that new knowledge to do other things.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's like realizing, I don't know, the world beneath the world, right? I went to college for, computer science. I had computer architecture, ones and zeros, how we build up all these numbers, how processors work. But I had no knowledge of actually how electronics or electricity worked until literally I started doing this several years ago. And that was one of those things of my entire career has been based upon electricity. And it is just magic to me. It's like I'm driving everywhere and I can't open the hood of my car. Right. And to be honest, I don't know much about automobiles or automotive engineering, but at least that's an area where I know my interest doesn't lie. But if you're like, listen, this is something I've spent a massive amount of my life doing, but I don't understand the underlying layers below it. So during the pandemic, I was like, why not start now with like electronics? And so this was something that introduced me to it. But changing lamps so that they go from, battery power to wall outlets, creating an electroluminescent jacket that lights up when triggered by audio for a friend's, dance party and things like that. Suddenly all of this becomes possible because you realize how this works, right? Even when you learn about, I don't know, I'm one of those people, I guess I'm very, this makes me, I don't know, cool, like a millennial or something like that. I learned a lot of this from YouTube, and you can watch old videos from 1960s about how soldering and all this stuff works, which is great because it's, has this very, this was a video that they probably showed at like a GE plant somewhere. And it's like, but electricity really hasn't changed and like soldering hasn't changed in all these years.
Just to take that tangent for a minute, there's all these old videos that came out of Bell Labs that are heavily actually like promoting technology from Bell Labs or whatever, or products, but they're like hosted by scientists. And this guy will come out in a lab coat and explain how the nervous system works or how electricity works or whatever. I watch that kind of stuff. You mentioned YouTube too. It's like some of those were so good and so interesting. and explained the concept so well. It made me always wish, like, man, I wish I could just take a class full of these videos, which is kind of what YouTube is now if you find the right sources.
Yeah, it's sometimes I think that there's sort of put on YouTube just for the aesthetic quality of them, where it's, again, coming out on film, some, fellow turning dramatically to the camera and saying, it's like, congratulations, you've begun your career in, in welding. And it's like, okay, wait a minute. Okay, there's so many levels going on here, but then the information getting shared is just fascinating. Yeah, I know there is a part of me that if I won the, lottery or something like that, just taking some of these courses, it's like, how does this work? I want to disassemble and reassemble, a dirt bike. Why? And it's like, I see them there. They're always running. I know generally how internal combustion works, but could I actually tear apart an engine? No, I couldn't do it now. And it's like, could I do that though, like by just watching YouTube?
Yeah, these days you could, yeah. So that's interesting you mentioned automotive stuff, because I recently explained to a fellow engineer friend that the first place where I learned troubleshooting was because growing up, my parents couldn't afford new cars and stuff. There was like 5 of us kids, and they were like one of those families, stretch a dollar and stuff. So my dad had grown up, both my parents actually grown up on farms. And so my dad knew some mechanical stuff to work on farm equipment, but it was just, it was impractical to take the car to get fixed by somebody else. And so even though I kind of hated doing this at the time because my other brothers were either busy or they didn't want to help work on the car or whatever, like I was kind of the kid who was like, okay, fine, I'll go hold the light for dad or hold the wrench or whatever. Where I learned my first set of troubleshooting skills and saying like, okay, there's this thing called a car and there's an engine, a suspension, tires, whatever. But inside the engine is all, he starts breaking out all these other parts. And he would start with like the car, I need to fix the car because it's doing X, Y, Z. Here's how I break down, okay, what are those symptoms being caused by? What are the possible causes? What can I try? What's the fastest thing for me to try to eliminate the most choices? And those kinds of core troubleshooting skills I picked up when I was a kid. But it really, I find, I moved into computer engineering. It was the same basic principles. It's like you need to understand the core concepts in whatever system you're working in. You need to be able to come up with a theory for why the behavior is happening so that you have some idea of what's the most efficient place to start looking. And then when you slowly over time get more and more familiar with the system or car engine or whatever, when something goes wrong, you're able to like leap to an answer that's surprisingly right a lot of times, or at least close enough.
Yeah. I mean, I know there was a meme I saw recently where somebody said, you're working on a 56 line piece of code and, the error says that there's an error on line 72, right? That is kind of a classic sort of place where a software engineer knows that they have to go deeper, right? You actually have to know probably what the JVM that you're operating on or whatever, right, is like, doing underneath the hood and everything like that. You have to understand the heap versus the stack of it. And like you said, sometimes if you know those things where you're like, you get this weird aberrant behavior and you're like, you're able to make those connections very, very quickly. And it's like, okay, yeah, go here and turn off this logging. You're like, wait a minute, why? And it's like, trust me, it's just the loggers doing this thing. And so it's loading this stuff in here and it's like going to cause problems for you, right?
Right. Like you're teaching someone. So you're describing a situation where somebody's like new to a system, for example. Maybe you're the experienced person. They ask you a question and you're like connecting 5 dots without even realizing it.
Yeah.
You're just like, oh, yeah, I've seen that or seen something like it. Go look over here. And on the receiving end, the person's like, how are you connecting those two things? They seem to have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah. Because programming, we operate in code, but code operates on other pieces of code, which operates on a system, which also has deployment things around it, right? And so we understand as developers, all of these are operating when somebody hits go and the code starts running. And so a junior engineer can just be looking at, I only have these 50 lines here. Which one of these lines is causing a problem for me? And it's the senior person who says, well, actually, it is something sort of outside of this that is either being triggered by this or being brought in, a lot of implicit statements and things that go on, right? So
yeah, you have like a much more complete model of the system in your head. And it's more sort of compressed and summarized too, because you can kind of, when you're really experienced in a system, you can jump from the super high level to the low level and everywhere in between more fluidly. But yeah, to get back to the electronic stuff, I always regretted a little bit not really practicing the electronic stuff. I've eventually given it up because I like to operate at the code level so much that I just decided I literally didn't have time to do that and the other stuff as much as I didn't have enough time to do electronics and the other stuff like coding that I wanted to do. But for someone, this includes me, who's not, I don't have an intuitive sense. Like I've soldered before, but I don't have an intuitive sense of what it feels like at the hardware level. So what I would describe when I work on a computer system or software system, you mentioned these like layers, right? There's like the hardware and then the system and then like all these layers of software. And then there's like you writing a program way at the top. And at that level, everything, like a whole bunch of messy physics details have just been completely erased. You're like presented with a perfectly orderly world in which you can build a sandbox and build all this stuff. But like, you can trust that basically your calculations are always going to be reliable. You can trust that like when you save something to a hard drive, that it's not just going to disappear. There's a whole bunch of uncertainty that's been removed for you by the time you're at that level. But how does that compare to like when you're building something with physical parts?
Well, that's actually a good point. I remember, I forget who the two engineers are from Google, but they were sort of viewed as the premier chair emeritus going way back to the early start of Google.
Talk about Larry and Sergey?
No. It was two of their initial like staff engineers, and they would always pair together. One would always have their hands on the keyboard and the other would always just be there sort of talking through it. The classic problem I remember them solving, it was probably like a New Yorker article or something. They would find that they were getting Heisenbugs, right? The classic, we're operating this, we're running all of these things on all of this cheap hardware to build a search engine, but randomly we're having memory issues. And so what they realized was that the memory chips that they actually had bought, the tolerances weren't as high as they expected, right? And that was something where somebody told me, it's like, oh, well, actually a lot of the computer chips that you operate at, it's sort of range of voltages, what actually even 0 and 1 are, right? Because it's at these very small nanometer levels and everything. So actually there's sort of this fuzziness that's operating even at that level that the amazing engineers at, AMD or, Intel have sort of abstracted away. So it just appears as like very clean, like you said, like ones and zeros. And
well, so let's unpack that a little bit because I understand most of what you're saying, but also the audience is not entirely engineers, right? So what you're saying is like, let's say I write a program to write a bunch of ones and zeros to save it in memory. I write 11001. And from the point of view of the programmer, that's all of reality. That's as deep as the mystery goes. That's it. It just, you can read and write and it
written
just
into
happens.
stone.
Yeah. And you can trust that it's going to be there when you go back and you don't have to jump through a bunch of hoops to make it reliable. But what you're saying is like down at the hardware level, first of all, things aren't binary. They're continuous. They're fluid. It's a lot more like an organic experience. But the hardware engineers are sort of like building the hardware in such a way that it interacts with software as if it's a discrete, controllable, precise machine.
Yeah. It's actually built on sand, but as the programmer sees it, it looks like it's carved into stone. One thing I remind me is when I was learning about electronics, the classic way to talk about it is that it's water, right? You're like, oh, well, voltage is just water going into a system. A resistor is, a thinning of the pipe. A capacitor is sort of like a intermediate tank along the way. And you're like, okay, wait a minute, water's going through this system, and you're able to explain all these components.
Yeah, so you make these analogies to like real world things you're used to interacting with.
But then there's this part where you're like, well, wait a minute, the charge is the reverse of that. So it's somehow going backwards. And so then electrical engineers are like, okay, so it's not actually water. So assume that it's actually a bunch of waves. And it's sort of that things are getting passed back and forth on it and things like that. And you're like, okay, that makes sense. And then there's suddenly a point where you're like, wait a minute, if these are waves, a transistor shouldn't be able to work. And it's like, okay, so now there are these atoms in there.
Yeah, I always love these moments, right?
Yeah. And so like suddenly the model becomes richer and richer. And suddenly you're like, okay, well, there's this NP layer and you're sort of doping this and things like that. So there's these little bits inside of, that allow actually these gaps to occur. And so you need to think about, and every time and so that was an experience I had when doing these electronics where, you have this simplified allegory for the model that works up to a point, and then you're like, well, wait a minute, there's this edge case. And suddenly you realize that edge case is everywhere. So now you need to have this more complex model, and suddenly it begins to open up more and more of how these things actually work. And so that's another thing that I've really loved about this too. Like even one of these things where I remember building a circuit and actually building it backwards, and I'm like, why is this working? And then I ended up having to go and, I can't remember what all the various like laws and stuff like that. And there's probably, a physicist out there where it's like, yes, it's the XYZ law and things like that. And you're like, oh, that this is what's actually occurring inside of the circuit. So that's why these circuits are basically symmetrical, right? You can replace one with the other. And it's like, because the electricity operates this way, right? The electrons are moving around. So they are indifferent to the fact that these things are ordered in these various directions versus if it was actually water coming down a path, you'd be like, no, the water would stop here and it wouldn't go any further.
Right. You're like, well, okay, gravity, first of all, doesn't apply here, and it's when the simple analogy you got to give you an intro breaks down. You're like, well, if it's like water, then all these other things I know about water must be true. And you're like, this is where the analogy breaks down and I have to explain why I summarized what's actually going on. And then you go deeper and deeper. I love that about software too. It's sort of like an infinite learning curve that you can keep going as deep as you want.
Oh yeah. And I would even say, so then going over to the topic of painting, there's a similar sort of quality too, right? Where when you're looking at a painting, right? And I always somebody I think of is JMW Turner, where you look at it and you're like, all these colors, and you're like, yeah, it's a picture of a boat at sunset. I understand this painting. Mm-hmm. You're like, well, that's true. But what if he didn't have oil paint? Would he be able to paint the same thing? And the default is, well, yes, he would have. It's like, well, actually, no, because oil paint has very translucent, very specific qualities to it that acrylic paint, egg temper paint, pencil don't have. It's almost impossible to recreate that. And even back then, a crucial thing, I remember seeing a very interesting presentation at the Tate in England where they talked about how it isn't like you just go around the corner to the local Blick and pick up art, paints. They're made out of all these weird materials and things, and they actually had to be discovered. And JMW Turner, I think, found a blue while traveling across Europe, and he was one of the first English painters to actually use it. And so suddenly the visual qualities, like literally it's going down to, can't remember, it's like gypsum or something, is like this like material science going into the painting, what sort of turpentines he's using to actually distill his painting, if he's using any sort of other materials in there, how he's actually, what type of canvas is he actually built it on? Has he actually primed it? What sort of priming? Is it actually gesso? It is something else. And all of these technical components go into it to actually produce this effect of, that's a boat at sunset.
Well, you can appreciate it at the boat level on its own, right? But there's all these other layers that this deeper appreciation, this deeper understanding that can enrich something a lot.
Yeah. Well, but I even think that going beyond that, where if he had painted this using different material, would it work? And that's like actually kind of the question of art, right? This is where it's different than like we were talking about with engineering, right? The satisfaction of you need to problem solve and there is only 5 valid solutions. And if you make mistakes, none of them will work, right? Like the electricity is going to win out. With painting, that's always the difficulty, or any sort of artistic thing. If it falls apart, right? It's like, okay, maybe that didn't work. But with painting, it's all up there on the canvas. I forget who it said is like the crucial skill of an artist is to know when to stop. An engineer, you have a general idea where it's like, well, it's doing everything it needs to do. I'm not adding anything else. But a painter, the true painter's like a sculptor too, where it's like, when do I stop chipping away at this marble? When does suddenly this statue of the emperor suddenly is like, well, he's only going to have 8 fingers now, right? Because, kind of lost a couple there.
Yeah. When's enough when you have the freedom to keep going as long as you want?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can keep applying more layers. You can add more colors.
Well, that explains the popularity of the cloud and software computing, even though most of those problems are pretty well solved for most people. Yeah.
No, totally. I don't know. Yeah. It's different sort of ways of approaching problems or having to think about stuff. So, yeah.
Do you feel like there's an analogy to the kinds of stuff you've done in painting to the quest to like find the perfect blue? But if you go back far enough in art history, you have to like literally find the materials and manufacture the blue yourself just to see if it'll be the right blue.
I mean, there have been a lot of painters who have done that. There's the French painter where his first name is Yves. He even has like Yves Blue. It's like literally patented after him. He came up with the blue. There was that paint that came out a couple of years ago, which is, made out of all of the carbon nanofibers. So it is like the blackest black ever. And that certain artists were actually allowed to actually paint with it and things like that. And so there is that quality to it. I mean, art really has moved towards the concept of art, right? I mean, that's been the biggest.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, ever since, the end of World War II, sort of, going back to Marc Chagall's point about, art begins where reality ends. Once we had photography, once we had photorealism, I personally view that is one reason why modernism took off. We entered into this modern age during the 20th century, and suddenly that's where abstraction came around, right? We're like, what? Pablo Picasso doesn't need to paint like Velázquez because Velázquez has already existed, and Pablo Picasso is living in the 20th century and in this modern time. So suddenly he's like, what is perception? What is this sensation that I'm trying to capture beyond just like the representation? And so then you suddenly get cubism, you get the abstract expressionist, you get everything that's come after, you get, the young British artists and everything. You get.
So instead of like focusing so much on technique and, for example, like trying to make, I mean, there's an artistic expression, but there's also like a period of art where people were trying to do kind of harder and harder things, more realistic things. And then when people felt like, well, that's been done and any properly trained artist could do realistic kind of things. What else is there?
Yeah. You don't want to be the 1,000th person to climb Everest. That might feel pretty good, but nobody's going to hang you in the Museum of Modern Art for that, right? So suddenly you're like, well, what if I created a spiral jetty out on the Great Salt Lake that would randomly get covered up by water or, receded and things like that? What does that actually mean, right? If every day that you go, the experience will be different. Everybody who looks at the Mona Lisa is going to roughly get the same experience every time, right? It is unchanging. Well, it's falling apart in ways, but
I know what you mean, though. But yeah,
it's like the experience of like land art and things like that. And so that's really one area that I think a lot of stuff goes to. So for me personally, and apologize for like really going off on the tangent here, I never really found that in art. I searched for it. Some people would say it's like, oh, you paint, so you're an artist. And I'm like, no. I view myself as a painter because I don't have a specific direction I'm going to. I don't have a specific concept I'm working towards. I don't know when to stop. I can work on various things. I liked representation, but even like people who worked outside of it in sort of strange ways, right? Like somebody like Chuck Close, who could do the hyper-realism paintings. He's the artist who does the giant, 12-foot tall faces, in immaculate detail that basically look like photographs. And then he had a injury, which forced him to relearn how to paint. And then he was able to reinterpret those, doing all these like sort of like small blobs and everything, right? And the way that he was able to look at the nature of looking, right? Which was very, very inspirational, but I didn't ever really have that thing. And I don't know, it requires a lot of work to search for that, and again, I don't have that community there, right? Where it's like, what am I looking at? How do I want to think about painting? What do I want to bring in? What do I want to deviate from? What am I getting inspired by? There's a large conversation there. So it's kind of like the difference between creating a program that you're going to try to get to customers and get people to actually like versus just taking part in some sort of leak code online coding challenge to be like, can you sort this list of random numbers faster than the last person did, right? I always felt that I was in that realm. I wasn't
in painting in particular.
Yes, in painting, where I was able to turn around and say, I now have a concept that I could go forward with that would engage with me and like create that conversation.
Okay. What was the first form of any creative outlet where you did feel that?
I mean, there was art, I would say, like painting. I've really got into, when I was in high school, German Expressionism. It was all of like, specifically the woodcuts. I love the idea of them doing these woodcut paintings, or I guess prints. And there's these very stark, but also quite beautiful, some of it quite primitive, but some of it also quite modern. Like, again, it was sort of lived in this weird liminal space between all of these things that they would create. Even the authorship of specific pieces was unknown, right? Because they were working as these collectives. And so, they would create these things. And
doing all these woodcuts?
Yeah. And that then they would, have these shows together. And it's like, oh, well, we can't remember who is that Kirchner's or not, right? It's like, well, and the art historians were the ones kind of like, the music record collector nerds, where it's like, well, actually, I found out that it was actually this person. And you're like, well, that's kind of not the point. I can understand why you find fun in doing that. And then growing up in the Cleveland area, there was a local artist, Derek Hess. So Derek Hess was an artist at the Art Institute there, and he worked at the Euclid Tavern as a bartender. I think he always said that he was also making chicken wings, but he did, like we used to have back in the day, flyers for shows coming up at the Euclid Tavern. So he'd do this very, expressionistic, really energetic ink drawings and stuff like that, and then have them printed. People really took to them. So then he started making silk screens of these. They really were like a big, they suddenly became kind of like collector's items. I collected all of them. I was very inspired by his combination of sort of taking like pop art, but also this sort of like very energetic, thing that was very similar to the German expressionism type of stuff. And that was very, very inspirational to me. And so that time, I was creating art that really kind of rejuvenated me. That's the word. And I was really, really interested in that. But then also that was towards the end of high school. And that was when, this is where, you go kind of like the whole point I assume of this podcast, right? Where you have actually your career, you have your main focus, and then you have these sort of creative outlets. My creative outlets weren't going to become my career. And so then I had this interest in math and computer science and all of that areas. And so art kind of took a seat there for a little while. And while I focused on that.
You think that was a pretty conscious decision? Like, were you aware, or would you have said it that way when you were young? Like, these creative things can't be my career?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Oh, okay. At least around high school age, or maybe even earlier?
Probably even earlier than that. Growing up in the Midwest, I grew up in the Akron area. So the deindustrialization of the area was something I was very, very aware of. So having skills that were useful and being able to build a career, and knowing that I was lucky enough to be someone who had this sort of interests in, somebody was like, I think computers are kind of the way of the future. Let's try to go that direction and stuff. So I knew that even at 8 years old, you sort of know with the poor starving artist trope, right? So that's kind of not for me.
So then do you think that the trope of suffering being necessary for great art is, what do you think about that?
So going back to Chuck Close, I remember watching this great documentary on him where he took a position at a college. So he went there. He's like, listen, I have to have a job. I need to teach. So he's like, I'm an artist who teaches. Then he said the next semester he was a teacher who is an artist. And then after that, he's like, I was a teacher who one time was an artist. And he decided at that point, he and his wife, to commit and completely break from that and move to, the Lower East Side in New York and commit fully to being an artist at that point. It's a tough road out there. Musicians I know, almost all of them have day jobs. And sometimes they even struggle with starting a family, trying to buy a house, those sorts of things where sleeping on the floor and getting paid $80 a night, to play music, often Topeka, as fun as that is, and they'd probably do that for the rest of their lives if they could, but they realize it's like, I need to have this other sort of career and stuff. So I know that's always kind of weighed on me.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you'd put it this way. I mean, I took a similar path. I guess the way I would describe it is that like the creative expression is what got me into technology. But I originally wanted to be a game developer way before it was like, I guess, a thing everybody wanted to do. But the bar for getting in was either you just build your own thing and get it out there and hope, or you go into these, by the early 2000s, were already like these grindhouses of like Electronic Arts and stuff at the time. And in places where they were trying to squeeze all of the artistic energy out of you, but it was a very, very much like a factory, and that didn't seem to jive with what I thought game development, like programming, was going to be. But programming still seemed, well, at first I just went into IT and support and that kind of thing. But like technology in general just seemed to be like a skill a lot of people would be willing to give you a job to do in one form or another.
Yeah. I mean, originally it didn't feel like I was trading a paycheck for art, because originally I went to college thinking I was going to become an academic. Parents were academics. I was like, I'm going to do artificial intelligence. And I want to do robotics, right? Like for me, that was just like, I was into that before it was cool, right? And even when I was in my undergrad, I really got into evolutionary computing and genetic programming. I actually, with a student of mine, did a genetic programming project for Quake 2, where we basically evolved robots to play Quake 2 because Quake 2 had this open API. People had written these bots to actually play it. Some of them were actually, designed to be aim bots to help people beat the game on public servers. But, we were just like, well, what if we did this and we tried to evolve it? And we actually had that as a part of our project. And we ended up getting to the Gecko conference in, was it 2000, 2001?
What's the Gecko conference?
The Genetic and Evolutionary Computing Conference stuff. I don't even know if it still exists at this point. And we presented there for like the undergrad, programs and stuff like that. And I ended up going to grad school at Michigan State to follow that. But after one semester being at grad school, I realized I was like, I think I've had enough of academia.
What was unappealing about it? Or something changed in you?
It was a combination of things. The one I remember was that the grad student housing in East Lansing was about 200 feet away from a heavy rail line that connected Detroit to the car factories in Lansing. The entire building would shake. And I only realized I had become acclimated to it when somebody came and visited me and a train went by and they were absolutely like, oh my gosh, what's happening to this building? I'm like, oh yeah, no, sorry. It was almost like the Blues Brothers, right? It was kind of crazy. Then that winter, there was ice in the roof. And so I had to completely move. And it was just sort of this very kind of, I wouldn't say hand to mouth lifestyle, but it was right after, the dot-com bubble had just popped, but there was still this sense of there's a lot of money in engineering right now and computers and software. And it's like, I kind of want to have that life, right? Like suddenly that seemed to be very, very appealing to me. And just, and then, maybe all of the creativity that I sort of saw in artificial intelligence or those sorts of things. I guess I just didn't see it there, right? And sort of the academic grind where you're kind of making incremental steps upon previous work and just following the scientific method a bit. It just didn't have that open playground aspect of it that made me initially fall in love with software. So I was like, well, I guess I'll go and do this other thing. Hopefully I can do some sort of fun work, but I definitely know I'm going to get paid a lot better.
Sure. Yeah. I can remember deciding, before I got my first IT job, I was just working normal sort of part-time jobs like retail and food service and that kind of stuff. At that point, I was, a teenager and already had a couple of jobs, already was super into technology. But I remember, I grew up in Phoenix and you can't really get around that city without a car. There's buses and stuff, but there was no light rail at the time or anything. You kind of had to have a car. And it was like getting a car when you were around 16 was like getting a bike when you were a kid. That's like the circle of things you could do suddenly expanded. And I just loved that feeling of the constantly expanding horizon of choices. And at some point when I realized that I may not like everything that goes on in business, but like I liked the pursuit of expanding my choices in life enough that I was like, well, I'm going to take the practical choice. I'm going to be like, go focus on making more money or just learning what people have to do that. And then later trying to connect it back to what I was passionate about, especially when I initially moved out and now suddenly I had to pay for everything I was consuming in life and, rent and all that stuff. Just the combination of those pressures and wanting that expansion of freedom just drove me to like, well, making more money seems at least it's a grind, but there's something there. And it will at least give me that expansion of choice, even if it takes, years and years.
No, I know that's the one thing they say about money, right? That the thing that money provides is just options and time, right?
Yeah. It gives you more ways to solve problems, but it doesn't fundamentally remove problems from life.
Yeah. And so having that, like that was the sort of experience again, maybe I had that when I was at grad school, right? I had a hand-me-down car that would randomly stall out, right? And, you take it to the shop and they can't figure out what it is. And I remember when I had my first job, I moved to Maryland and my car stalled out like on my commute home. And I went to work the next day. I'm like, yeah, man, my buddy, my car stalled out. And my coworker, without missing a beat, turned to me, he's like, you can afford buying a new one, right? And it was like, and like that, that was like a revelation to me. I was like, oh, this is a light bulb moment. It's like, I have that, right? I'm very much live with inside of my means. I'm not going to buy some extravagant car. It's like, I just need to replace the hand-me-down used car that, I'm dealing with right now.
Yeah, with like a Corolla or something, like practical, yeah.
I bought a Honda Civic, basic Honda Civic. I think it might have even been, maybe that was my first car with like power windows.
I remember that moment when I first had power windows, yeah.
Yeah, you're just like, wow, this is actually pretty cool, And then I think that it's that sort of thing too, where going back to my folks, they did kind of keep their creative pursuits, right? I mean, my mom always knitted, always sort of did things around that. She liked Klaus von Oldenburg. So like the big like stamp, like an installation where it looks like, just like a giant stamp that says free on it or whatever, like the giant lipstick, like that's Klaus von Oldenburg. So she actually created, soft Klaus von Oldenburg style stuff for our house. So we had these classic pillows that were like a hamburger in our house. And there was one that looked like a giant, Polaroid camera and stuff. And we just had them in our house. And my dad would do all of his trains and he would do woodworking. And so having that enriched life, it always seemed that it was there, right? And so for me, it never seemed to be like, oh, well, if I go and pursue money, I will have options. And one option is the fact that I can continue to pursue these things. But I do sort of realize, like I said, without the community for a long time, a lot of that kind of sort of withered away, right? Like it's just very hard to be the single engine of agency when it comes to creativity, right? Like sometimes you just kind of need to be in the thick of it, even passively sitting in that conversation. That can just be the sort of thing where it's like, oh, these people seem to be really excited about this. I'm going to get excited about it too. Like I can feel my heart rate kicking up a bit. Like suddenly, ideas start coming to you a little bit.
I can identify with that because I mean, programming was the first thing that just completely absorbed me when I discovered it. I mean, I was into other things as a kid, but we had this computer at home. It was like a secondhand computer we'd gotten from like a relative or something. And I remember being really excited and I didn't know anything about it. And I was like, how fast is this thing? Like how powerful is it, whatever. And the guy that gave it to us, like he was very kind, but he could see I was getting really excited and that he was about to let me down. And he's like, well, let me put it to you this way. If my pocket calculator is like a 2, this thing's like a 1. I was like, okay. But that didn't dampen my spirits too much, because I mean, I knew I was interested in those things, but I didn't really know what any of it meant, I knew that like faster computer meant you could do more with it, but I didn't have a practical sense for if that was even really a limitation or not, right? I actually wonder if I would have found something else I was passionate about if it wasn't for this one feature of the computer, which is it had a break button on the bottom where you could be running any program at all. You'd hit the button, it'd say break on line, whatever. And then you could type a list and then the line number, and it would just spit out the code for any program on the computer. And I was like, holy crap, this is how this is done. And there were things like variables and math equations and stuff. And at the time, I hadn't taken algebra yet, but my older brother had. And I remember distinctly like slipping a note under his bedroom door one day, like saying, can you teach me what a variable is? Because I seem to need to know what that is in order to read this program over here. He explained the basic concept, in an afternoon. And I was like, oh, okay. And that's how things kind of unraveled for me. I had access and time and it was free. And then like, here's, tens of thousands of lines of code to just be like, I don't know what any of this does. I'm going to start my own program and just start typing them in and see what they do, and just kind of like reverse engineer most of it from the hard way, really. But yeah.
Yeah, there definitely is something nice when you can have an effective sandbox, right? Like, and so something like painting can be that way. Even if you struggle with a material, well, as long as you have enough of it and no one really cares what you're doing, you can experiment and have your consistent learning failures, right? The Edison thing, I know 1,000 ways to not make a light bulb, right? Like being able to do that with electronics, that for me, that was always kind of the difficulty, right? Where there's the quality of, well, if it doesn't work, like again, you're like, okay, all of this stuff is dead. Somebody needs to help me get it to a point where it's at least alive, right? And at least then you can sort of kind of undo things a bit. And I never really had that there. But yeah, I think like you said about the computer programs where it could break. I don't know. I think that, what was the time where I was like, oh yeah, it's like you can sort of just write whatever you want a bit. I don't know. I have to think about it. That doesn't really come to me like what specifically in computers, like I had that kind of aha moment though.
Where you thought like, oh, this could be a creative machine. I could come up with an idea and then translate it here and see it.
Yeah, that I actually I'm not passive to this technology, right? Like I can actually impose my will upon it and things will occur, right? I think that a lot of kids who are artistic, right? Or I mean, even like sports or have just sort of like an innate ability, adults can point that out right away where it's like, oh, you're an artistic kid. Why? And it's like, well, because we told everybody to, draw a squirrel and this person here drew over like three circles that barely touch each other, while you actually, we're like, oh, well, this has this sort of shape to it, right? Suddenly the kid who can throw, the perfect spiral with the football, suddenly they're throwing a jersey on him, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know really where that was with computers for us.
I meant to actually make a point about the community thing that you mentioned, though. I totally distracted myself. I was going to say that I can relate to the needing the community, and certain things kind of faded away without it. There was not a lot of kids trying to do programming in middle school in 1992-ish. A lot of kids, use computers. We had computers in school, but which is a funny thing to say, that like growing up, most people didn't have a computer. Now we all have like several on our body all the time. But it was hard to find other people that were into it. And when I finally did, I usually found out that they were into a different aspect of it and that we didn't have much in common. And even when I got to college, well, actually, by the time I got to college and I was in software engineering classes, like the formal stuff, at that point, I'd already been writing code for like 10 years. And I wasn't a professional by any means, total amateur still making tons of amateur mistakes. But at least I had been trying a bunch of stuff. And at that point, I couldn't find many kids who weren't back at the beginning of the learning process. And so to this day, I never really wound up attaching to a community around software, for example, except at work, because it's a natural community of people that are literally working on the same thing.
No, that's interesting. I mean, have you participated in any sort of like open source or any of that type of community at all? Or
I've tried that stuff. Open source I've never really clicked with it. I mean, I've given feedback and stuff or recommended a couple bug fixes here and there. But yeah, not really. Not really. I mean, I publish all my stuff for the most part open source now, but that's mostly because I don't care to control it. And also nobody cares about anything I write. So I'm really just using the online platforms as a place to store my code. So yeah, I wouldn't say I do open source at all. And even with the game dev stuff, I'm in a couple of communities, but I'm very much, I just drop in once in a while and I say a few things. I'm not an active member of it. I feel very solo about this until recently, like when I started working with an artist and stuff to do the things I'm not good at. But yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess I'd ask, because this was something that I was thinking about too, when you're talking about the community aspect of it. And specifically then I was also thinking about fine art in college, which I never experienced directly, but I had a lot of friends who are writers or got, graphic or fine art degrees and things like that. Is there an aspect of some of these communities that you feel that are more about the community versus actually the thing? I guess where, like you said, because I've had the same experience, right? Where you're like, well, I'll attend, I'm there, I don't really speak up because the conversations that we're having aren't actually the conversation that we're not making art. We're sort of talking about art, but even then we're talking about art in sort of like a weird chest pounding gorillas, trying to...
You're trying to like show off about how much you know about art instead of like, let's get together and make art or...
Yeah, that it's not it's not about collaboration, it's about positioning.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say there's an aspect to that. I mean, I don't like to just chit chat about the thing casually. I like to go really deep into stuff. I remember actually a moment in my 20s, I used to talk about programming all the time to anybody who would sit there and tolerate me boring the shit out of them. And then one day I just realized, I was like, nobody fucking cares. Like, nobody cares about this like you do. Like, talk about something else. And so for probably 20 years, I basically didn't talk to people about programming.
Interesting.
Yeah. Even a little bit at work when I started to do it professionally, kind of the fire got stirred up again for a while. But then there were aspects of that positioning stuff you're talking about where it's like, aren't we here to build something? Like I was always interested in building the thing, not interested in the like, let's rank everybody and talk about who's the best programmer or whatever. I'm like, I just don't care.
Yeah. Because even in electronics or in software, there's often many solutions to solve a problem, right? And for me, I've always been, and maybe this is one reason why I also like management, where I'm very kind of agnostic to the solution. It's like, give me the solution that works. If you give me a solution that means we don't have to work on it, we don't have to touch this code again in the future, and that you're happy with it, that's even better, because then that means that I can have you do other stuff or you can come up with other cool things. Yeah, the rank and yank aspect of stuff where it's very much like, we're going to battle to see whose decision is the one at the end. It's like, I don't know, that has just never appealed to me. I mean, even when it comes to music or movies, I understand, well, It's always odd to me when people try to be very objective about films, where I'm like, you can be objective about your perspective, but it's a wholly subjective experience, right? Where it's like, why is this movie better than this other one? You can talk about all these aspects of it, and somebody can be like, yes, that's the greatest movie of all time. Bores me to tears.
Yeah. I used to be kind of a hardliner about that stuff, though, too, because when I was really into it and would talk to anybody about it, I think I was seeking other people that felt that strongly about it. And I just kept searching. And I was like, I never really found people like that. They're not very many. So, yeah, well, you were talking about like objective and subjective evaluation of something, some experience. And yeah, I had a very similar experience where I was just like, the things people seem to notice or care about when it came to software building things just didn't seem to be the things I cared about. I understood that my program had to be fast enough, and I would occasionally get interested in making it really fast, but I would get pretty bored pretty quickly once it was like faster than I cared for it to be faster. I was just like, okay, what can I do with this?
Yeah, that optimization for optimization's sake is sometimes a good exercise, right? And even when starting off, right, I think that maybe is an aspect of it where through talking about programming or any sort of skill, a part of it is about demonstrating expertise. A part of it is like what you talked about, where you're trying to find fellow seekers, right? Like it's sort of like a shibboleth where it's like, I'm going to talk randomly about the overhead of running something on Ruby versus a JVM, right? In terms of, and if you say certain words that, and certain people's like their heads turn where you're like, oh, okay, you're right. Like that person, everybody, it goes from being Greek and it's like, okay, that's somebody I can actually talk to about it. But I also think there is an aspect too, where being able to voice a lot of these things that we search for individually, that the conversation's only going on in our head, being able to actually share that and communicate knowledge about it, and especially to convert potentially someone who isn't on the same page as us, there's a quality of that is, okay, I've attained a level of mastery of it, right? Like I was talking about, electricity is water. It's like if you get to a certain point, often a master of something can describe something in a very, like, again, find that allegory to describe it where a layperson understands what you're talking about. And I also find that like when you're talking to folks about things that, sometimes you're like challenging yourself. Can I explain this to somebody in a way where they understand why this is important, even though it's not important to them?
So I started doing the monologue episodes, just talking about why was I doing this? And I've run into a lot of people who have something else other than work that they do that they find creative and fun.
Yeah.
So I just thought I'd start talking about that.
No, I mean, cool. Yeah. Well, because I've always viewed you as somebody who's had a lot of interests like that, right? I mean, you had the photography, you had your bikes and stuff, right? I mean, you have even down here, right? There's very much
so weird. I forget I owned motorcycles sometimes, but God, it's a beautiful 5 years.
Yeah. And like for me, I love seeing those sort of things, right? I guess like, so the smartest person I ever knew was this fellow named Ernie Vincent. He was a student at MIT while my dad was an RA there. Brilliant guy. Like he had an eidetic memory. I can't remember what it is. Basically, he could read something or hear something once and he would remember it forever. This is interesting. Ironically, he was an audio engineer, stuff like that. And so he did all these things. He basically ran his own company, stuff like that. He just collected stuff, but he collected knowledge. And I remember, I met him when I was a young guy and things like that, go up to the Boston area. They were out in New Hampshire, stuff like that, his family and stuff like that. And he always liked to have stuff and do all these things. But only later did I realize that and maybe this goes to the point too on communication, he could talk to anybody and he would talk to them about anything. And often anything that they wanted to talk about. I remember that they ended up getting a lake house on Lake Winnipesaukee. And I think like his wife was describing the fact, it's like, oh yeah, my husband was next door talking to the guys who are mechanics because he saw that they had boats out there. And he was literally just letting them talk about boat engines and these sorts of things. And he would soak up this information. I realized in my life, there was probably a lot of useful information, a lot of useful conversations I had with people who had all these sort of eclectic interests, right? That when I was younger, I was like, I'm not interested in that filter, right? Like click it off and just like that, noise canceling headphones sort of approach. I'll just wait for my turn to talk. I realized, again, like to what I mentioned, the social aspect, the community of just being it's a better life when you bring in all these other people. But often you learn a lot of useful things or perspectives about stuff that you wouldn't have done naturally on your, first order of stuff. Like another thing I think about that I really like, I love watching documentaries on surfing and skateboarding and snowboarding. Snowboarded a little bit when I was in high school, never done the other two. Yet it's fascinating watching these athletes do this stuff, right? There's like a creativity at it. It's like, why did you decide to do this? Why did you make these like tool changes? Why did you think you could possibly do X, Y, and Z, right? And there's just, I don't know, there's something very refreshing about doing that, even though I don't even have to say I have any interest in doing that type of stuff. And so, I don't know, Ernie sort of inspired me that way on things where it's like, tell me what your main hobby is, tell me what your passion is, and, convince me, right? Like, walk me through just like your journey into it.
I love that stuff. I think when I realized people didn't want to hear me talk about programming, I still wanted, way before I got into computers, I always had a curiosity. I always wanted to know how everything worked. And for me, that never really stopped. For a while, I was just asking random, how does this, how did that work? It could be some industrial system and series of pipes, and how is gas refined? Or how are mines dug, and why are they built this way and not that way? Why are these set of rules around a policy in a city for this law set up that way? Like, what are they trying to accomplish? So I just always had this like curiosity just to know why. And so those are some of my most fun conversations when I don't have to do much of the talking, because I'm like, I'd rather somebody come up, say hi, and strike up a conversation, like get us through the chit chat part. And I would just rather go straight to, hey, like, what are you into? What do you do? Whatever. And then I try to ask a really intelligent question right off the bat, or at least some question to like get the person to light up and talk about the thing they love. And I just love listening to that kind of stuff.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, like my wife, she loves baking and she loves thrifting and she loves fashion, like the creative aspect of putting together an outfit and why it succeeds or fails. And her key thing is that she's not going to solve that problem with just like spending oodles of money at it, right? Where it's like, it is a composition in a way, and it's a fluid composition, right? It's like, it isn't static. It needs to, your clothing is 360 degrees all around you, and you need to move in it, and you need to wear it for an extended period of time, and you need to wear it in certain circumstances among other people in a certain situation. And never really thought about clothing that way. And, for her, it's something that brings her much joy. And I don't know, like talking to her about it is just fantastic. Because like you said, it's like, walk me through this, right? Like, why are you putting these things together? Why did suddenly putting on that pair of shoes make you take off everything else? Because you're like, none of this now works, right? And you're like, wait a minute, you had everything. You just need to throw shoes on your feet and hit the street. And it's like, no, this isn't going to work now. You're like, okay, now you're just, with a Western wear shirt and jeans. It's like, what is this process here, right? And yeah, it's a true passion, not something that, I personally have. But yeah, that just, how do you get into that? And how is it something where you keep on having that, is drawing you forward into it?
Mm-hmm. I think for most of the hobbies I've been into, I always start with the question of like, mechanically, how does this work? Like, how do I take a good photograph? Why did this one come out too dark? Why is this one fuzzy? Why do I just naturally like this photo and not this photo, or this style and not that style? And start peeling that stuff apart. And then it's only after a long time of, for me, my process was always like, I just want to know how it's accomplished. And it's not until much later in the hobby where I start having sort of like even artistic thoughts of like, I feel like doing some woodworking today, but let's just go see what wood is out there and maybe I'll come up with something. Like that came for me way later, and I really didn't do a ton of it. Most of it's like, I have a thing I need to build and I'm going to go build that thing.
Interesting. Yeah. There are two major theories of creativity that I've carried for one, and you just kind of described a third one. And I was like, these are, I don't want to say that these are like, these are the two types of creativity. So Nietzsche described creativity as an artist being disgusted by something, and through that disgust being like, this is something, sort of a negative approach, right? Where you're like, I can't understand why people did X, Y, and Z, so I'm going to make this other thing, right? Like we were talking about earlier, where my wife's like, she doesn't like lime. Somebody made a margarita with lemon. Why aren't people making more margaritas with lemon, right? Like that's like literally a perfect example of that. But then Harold Bloom, he worked at Yale. He was the great Shakespearean academic. He had many artists find an artist that they like and they copy them until they become so expert at copying that their mind wanders and they end up making a mistake. And one of those mistakes that they end up making becomes interesting, and that's how they find stuff. You, though, I think you've described like a very like engineering sort of thing, right? Where it's like, there's understanding that this isn't magic, right? Like if I open this up, there isn't going to be like a little ooh, like spirit, like a cartoon, like pop out of it, and suddenly it's going to be an empty box. It's like, no, there are parts in here, and there are parts that aren't in here that don't need to be in here. But maybe there's like, this could be improved, but like this does everything that it does, right? And you would need to change this or add things or remove things to change how it actually operates, right? And so it's like, you're like, okay, well, if I need to do that, how do I do it, right? Like how can I, the classic Woz and story, right?
Steve Jobs and Wozniak, yeah.
Yeah, when he had, it was like, yeah, can you take out the, what was it, the ICs out of this? And Wozniak, and he's like, hey, Wozniak, can you do it? And he was like, sure. And you do this sort of thing. And what, he only gave him part of the money or something? But yeah. But anyway, I mean, that's like a classic engineering problem. You give an engineer something where you're like, this can be reduced. Tell me how, you can back as an hour for, normal form this thing down into a smaller problem set.
Yeah. Like I think photography is the best hobby for me to think about how my creative process works. So, okay, I got into photography in the weirdest kind of way. I was 23 and I just separated from my wife at the time, and we were definitely going to get divorced. So nothing was finalized or anything, but I was just left, like I was really young to have this marriage. And yet it was obviously a very significant part of my life, especially at that age. It was like, seemed like a huge length of my life too. And suddenly it was like shattered, right? I was like, well, this isn't working. And my wife moved out, and I looked around the house and I thought, I have all these memories of everything I just went through, but I don't have any proof that any of it happened. And I wanted, I guess, some mementos. It was almost like realizing I hadn't remembered to keep anything special along the way. Yeah. And so that drove me to photography. I was like, I'm going to start capturing things in my life because I don't know what's going to be important to me in the future. So I just want to just start capturing everything and just see what sticks. And that drove me for a few years. So that was a little bit more of a, I don't know if I'd say creative, but more of just a curiosity thing, wanting to just like take little pieces and keep them with me, almost like a memory hoarder or something. And then after that, I found that I just found the technique interesting. And then I went deeper into the technique, and I just wanted to know how to do all these different things. Like, oh, I love that shot. How the hell did they get the light that way? Yeah. What time of day was that? What kind of lens they use? All this other stuff, right? And just technique. And then I did that for I was really into it for about 10 years, did some landscape stuff, did some portraiture for a little while. And then at the end, I sold all my equipment just a couple of years ago, and I just stopped. But then up to that point, like I had a few photos I'd say I was proud of that were beautiful and creative in some ways, but I never felt that like artistic spark you were talking about, where you go from just copying or just imitating to now something novel, right? And the strangest thing happened. So like I bought a new camera last summer. We've been doing gardening in our backyard, and I've been photographing flowers, which is like a very classic art thing to do. But suddenly I can bring like 10 years of technique to like, wow, that's a gorgeous flower. I'm going to get right up close to it. I'm just going to take the best possible photo I can of it. And honestly, some of those photos are some of the best photos I've ever taken. I was like, holy shit. Now I understand why people like flowers so much. Number one, but yeah.
Yeah. And that is one thing, I haven't painted in a while, or really done like any sort of art. Right. And I mean, even as an engineer, we've had that experience too, or like writers, right? Where it's like, one of the best things you can do is do something and then put it down and walk away from it. Right. Because sometimes the context is clouding a lot of your judgment and about what is possible in something a bit. And you're like, okay, I need to step away from it. Need to clear my memory, right? Need to, load up something else. And then when I load it back in, suddenly you're like, wait a minute, you do have all of those skills that you can fall back upon. But suddenly you realize you end up with a certain amount of clarity around something, right? Where you're like, okay, all of this was unnecessary. That actually is one writer. Suddenly, like, this is a place where I can actually apply it. Things like that too. So that's a interesting point. I mean, so would you consider yourself going back into photography? Or are you just like, this is just a place where you're just like...
Not really. But this time around, I'm really just able to appreciate the joy of it. And I'm not thinking about the technique very much. Now it's like I can just do all the things I need to do. Like, flip the camera to all these settings just right and get it just right. And I know how to frame things. And, So now I barely think about the technique. Now it's about actually being present in front of the thing, which is different than the first 10 years. But I think a lot of my hobbies have fallen along those the way. That's how I got into programming too, is like I had an initial creative spark that pulled me in, and then like a decade of technique, I just had to know how everything worked. And then only after that could I come back to it and step back and be like, okay, but what do I want to say? What do I want to do with this? There's the practical sort of work side, like, oh, I'll go get a job writing business software. But then on the creative side, it's like, well, if I could build anything, what are the interesting constraints I could put on myself to actually do something worthwhile that's satisfying to me, you know?
Well, and that's kind of my point about being a painter versus an artist. I guess it's the generalized version would be just being a practitioner versus being an artist, right? Where one is I have the skills and the ability to do these things, but I have this specific thing to say that I wish to do out of it, right? Where the way I think about it is no one would really tell an artist what to do, like what they want you to make. I've had friends ask me that too, where it's like, oh, I'd love to have some of your art. I'm like, okay. And then they're like, yeah, I want you to make X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. You're like, oh, you want a commission.
Yeah. It's like, I'm not a freelancer, right? I'm not a practitioner where it's like, that doesn't interest me. But if I actually was an artist, I don't think people would do that, right? Like if you're a photographer and you have a very specific style where it's like, well, I want you to do this, but I actually want you to make it look like Ansel Adams. It's like, well, then you get an Ansel Adams photograph. Like you come to Jeff, to get this specific style of thing. And I don't know, I think that really is like an area where on almost all of these things where individuals, are they going to you as just sort of like you're just a commodity that you're fungible in terms of your technique? Or are they going to you because it's like, no, there is a very clear depth, not just of expertise, but of like you said, artistry that they really want to get.
Yeah, like it's a difference between going to the store and saying, help me design this living room and the furniture and, that kind of thing versus going to someone who really designs furniture and you say, look, here's what I want my home to feel like. And I like your interpretation, the way you've seen the world through your creative art. Like, I want something that makes me feel that way, but I want it through your eyes as an artist. And that's like about as hands-on, I think, as you can get. If you want to get something that's truly a piece of art from that artist, as opposed to something you ask them, like, I want you to fit in this box,
Yeah, because if you like a classic thing, it's like an Eames lounger, right? The classic mid-century chair and stuff like that. Well, if the Eames are still around, it's like, I love this lounger that you make. Could you make me a sofa? Right? You're like, okay, well, we don't make sofas. And it's like, I think most people would find it odd that it's like, yeah, I'm going to go to this artist who, they make this sort of like thing, like you said, and then just, I love this. So why don't you do something completely different? It's like, no. You like their name is associated with this specific type of chair and these sort of things. It's like, you go there for that. If you want that, you would go somewhere else. Right. So it's like going to McDonald's and looking for, I don't know, like a really good burrito. It's like, okay. Now I don't feel like I'm either disparaging McDonald's or disparaging like every artist out there, but I don't know.
Like, I could roll this Big Mac for you if you want, but I don't think that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the easier solution is just go right across the street to the taqueria over there.
I thought you were a hamburger artist. God damn.
Yeah, I know, right?
What is this crap?
I am insulted that you're not doing everything that I just walked up to you to say, right?
Yeah. What's next for you?
So I am doing more complicated DIY kits at this point. There's, like I said, a community out there that does a lot of this. Like there's one company out of Poland, Dreadbox, who I really like their synthesizers. They do DIY kits from them. I've been building those, stuff like that. I want to get more expert on building these pre-made complicated kits. Then there's actually I want to say it's Arduino based. There's this chip specifically designed for audio engineering called Teensy that has like a lot of the basic kind of oscillator features and everything in it already baked into it in all the ICs, so that you can just start building electronics from the get-go with that versus having to compose together a bunch of general purpose stuff. So I'd love to go in that direction. I don't know, maybe at some point I actually need to use these things to actually make some noise out of it, right? And have something come out of it. Again, I think that there is, like I said, that quality of you build something and then turning it on and actually getting the sound out of it. My hope is through that process, I would actually find something that's interesting to me. Like, again, in moving into like that thing where it's like, I'm just not building it. Now there is an artistic door that is open for me that I want to head down, and something that I'd potentially, want to share with other people.
How many kits have you built? And like, how many of these boxes projects have you done, you think?
Probably half dozen or so. Built sequencers, built some drum machines, built some frequency modulation based synthesizers. One thing too is that I very much like a checklist. So I have a Google Doc that shows all of the things that I'd love to buy. Once I buy it, I color that line blue. Once I actually build it successfully, I color it green. And hate to say it, some of them, when I don't build them and they don't work, then I color them gray, right? But then I also put a date on there, right? So I have sort of a running log of things that I've successfully built over time. Like I said, I built a guitar pedal kit that I actually, for my friend who's like a musician and stuff, and I gave it to him for his birthday. So even just things like that, like, I know there's going back to, having small tangible victories that I can share with other people in a way that sometimes being a manager and saying, hey, we hit, regulatory delivery deadline. We're all very super excited about it. The lights are still going to be on when we come back to work on Monday. I'd rather be able to flick a switch and see a bunch of lights and weird sounds come out.
Yeah. Yeah. So the function of keeping that log for you is to see the progress you're making?
Yeah. I mean, in both directions, right? Where it's like there's things that you see online where it's like, man, that'd be something I'd love to potentially build here. Well, and I'm old. Those are the sort of things that you forget about at some point, right? You're like, dang, yeah, I think I remember seeing a GitHub page where somebody was building, a groove box that you could assemble from parts. Gee, I wish I remember what that was, right? And it's like, so, well, I have a place where that lives. But also, just seeing that I have been making progress, right? It's kind of like tracking your weight or tracking the number of reps that you do when you start taking up fitness and stuff, right? It's not always monotonically increasing, right? Sometimes you have setbacks. Sometimes, you have weeks where you don't cut any weight or, you're not gaining more, pounds and stuff like that. But, I don't know. You just want to see it's like, okay, I was able to knock a few of these things out last year. I was able to get a couple of wins under my belt. And that's very satisfying.
Is that enough to keep you motivated when things like maybe you're having like a string of tough projects that aren't working out or?
Ooh, I would say no. Actually, that just did literally happen to me with a kit that I got from Dreadbox. It was a complicated synthesizer, 2 PCB boards, one which was actually the control board, the other one that actually was the motherboard with all the brains on it. Put it all together, checked all the voltages, stuff like that. All the voltages came out right within, the specs on them. Assembled the thing, put on power, light doesn't go on. Contacted the builders out there. They said, hey, maybe there's a couple of these, male-female connectors you need to switch. Try to do it. Desoldering is a very critical skill. That's sort of like, you think that, oh, well, I can put things together. Taking them apart should be just as easy. There's much more of an art form to that.
Without destroying everything.
Yes. And so that was something I did. I actually ruined the PCB while trying to take some parts of it and stuff like that. You're pulling things apart, a little bit of, the board comes off, contacted them, and they said, well, if you want to ship it to us, we'll try to figure it out for you, right?
Come to think of it, that might have been the point at which I gave up electronics. So I was like, desoldering, I don't like this.
It's a very nasty part of the thing, right? It's a lot of flux. It's a lot of cleaning materials and everything. It gets really gross. Sometimes the best solution is to just break something and tear it apart. And then you're like, we got a couple of more resistors. I'll just pop those back on, right? But yeah, I don't have really support mechanism around it, right? So very much this is just driven by me as an individual. Other people are kind of interested in my hobby, but like to your point, I can bore people's ears off talking about these things. And so generally I don't out of, trying to be a gracious, guest on things like that. But yeah, actually I have to say talking to the folks at Dreadbox was kind of a positive experience. We're like, hey, we'll help you out with this, right? And there was something just very satisfying about it, even if I'm not solving it myself, right? Sometimes you need the expert to come in and it's like, this is the solution. Because, after they've, knock on wood, they fix it, then the question that you ask is like, okay, what did you do? Tell me what you did. Tell me how you went through that, right? To your point about how did you make that logical jump about why this code isn't working? It's like, okay, let me explain to you on this deeper level, right? And hopefully failure just turns into an opportunity for growth.
Yeah. I've certainly come to appreciate the failures a lot more I mean, I'm familiar with all the cliches about like, failure teaches you more and all that. And I can identify with that. But I've actually changed my relationship with failure to the degree where I can laugh about it and be like, okay, well, I learned a hard lesson this time. And it's like an enjoyable part of the process instead of just feeling like a defeat. But I guess it's probably because I've built enough things in different forms, whether it's trying to figure out a photography project or trying to build out the software and like get it to do a certain thing, that you kind of have to take an absurdist approach and just be like, man, you're going to fuck this up like 1,000 times before you get it right consistently, like just enjoy it already,
Yeah. I mean, and that the one nice thing with electronics too is that outside of some larger components, a lot of this stuff is incredibly inexpensive, right? I mean, like resistors, like you're talking about fractions of cents, things like that. So you're like, well, that didn't work. You're like, okay, back to the drawing board, right? You're like, okay, something blew up. I mean, the worst thing you can do is like one time I ended up accidentally not unplugging something wherein you touch a hot wire and you feel that electricity shoot through your body. That's a very invigorating experience. And you're like, so I'm not going to do that a second time, right? But hey, I lived, right? My heart is still beating at a good rate and stuff.
I just electrocuted myself a little bit a couple of weeks ago, actually. Plugging something in a really dumb way, but anyway.
Yeah, there's just like that really quality. You're like, wow, okay, yeah, I'm not sticking the fork in the socket, but But actually, one reason I'd have to say that did make me think about one reason why I've sort of fallen away from painting a bit, which the success metric of it, where maybe you could talk, you might have a perspective on this too, right? Where sometimes you build something and when you look at it, all you see are the faults on it. With painting, there can often be a quality where you talk to friends or individuals who see it and they praise it, right? Sometimes you view that as just like sort of like nice flattery. It's like, hey, nice job, right? Like, nice job, champ. You're like, okay.
Gee, thanks.
Yeah, gee, Dad, thanks. I'm, really appreciate it. And sometimes, even with some of the work I've done, that people see it, they're very surprised that and it's like, wait a minute, you did this? Like, yeah. And they're like, okay, really? And yeah, I mean, I can just, do some of this artwork, and that they are really astonished and they praise you on it. But even then, like I said, there's the frustration that actually it's like, while it turned out satisfactory, it wasn't either what I wanted to make, or you see the flaws, or it still isn't where you want it to be. Right. Where if you fix your car and like, you're like, man, I, ruined all these parts and stuff like that, and I basically had to throw things away. Well, as long as your car runs, people are like, okay, well, that's fine. Right. With sometimes with artistic things, there's that scope where you're just like, you're overpraising something that, trust me, this is unimportant. This isn't that great, right? That you built, that you made, where it's like, this is sort of a sketch. This is a practice. This isn't actually a final, fully formed, right? In the way that something very tangible, like an engineering project can be, right? Where you're like, okay, the synthesizer on the inside might be really ugly. All the solders might be crap, but hey, if it turns on and makes noise correctly, okay, well, nobody's going to know, right? You close it all up and nobody's going to notice. But, for artwork, it's all out there. It's all, in the nude, I guess.
That's also something else that's changed for me. Speaking of, it's all out there, right? I've also, like, in addition to being able to deal with failure differently, I recently have gone back to play some old games that I absolutely loved to see, like, how did they pull that off? Like, why did I feel so engaged with this thing? And I realized in my head, I'd created all this complexity that's not actually in the game. And now that I can understand how all the parts are put together, I'm like I go back to, what's a good example? There's this whole game called Choplifter. I don't know if you ever played this.
Oh, yeah. I remember Choplifter. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is you take off in a helicopter. It's like a side-scrolling thing, and you'd have to fight through enemies and rescue these hostages and take them back to a base. That's the whole premise, right? But I remember that being so exciting. This was like the 80s. Airwolf was on TV. It was like, there was cool stuff. Like there was a Top Gun and all that kind of stuff, right?
Blue Thunder.
Yeah. Yeah. Iron Eagle 3. I mean, let's not forget the classics, right? But I had layered all this like coolness and complexity and stuff onto the game. And I went back and played it recently, and I was like, oh, this is not, like, I added all that as the player in the same way, like you read a book and there's the story and the bones and the plot and all that stuff, but you add the visual imagination in your mind of like what's actually happening. You add all this stuff, and like a lot of the subjective experience of loving a thing is what you bring to the experience, right? I also like went back and played Diablo 2 recently. That was another game that I just played like crazy. I loved it. And then this time I went back and I was like, oh, this is this is just a Skinner box. Like a lot of games are Skinner boxes, but I was like, this is actually a really simple Skinner box. I was like, I thought this thing had like 100 parts and it actually has like 30. I was like, oh. So the point I'm getting to here is like, I was able to start accepting that my thing wasn't the grand thing I envisioned, because I started to realize most of the things I admired actually weren't what I thought they were. I was seeing them for what I wanted them to be, plus everything I was bringing. I wasn't seeing them straight for what they were. And now that I can kind of see the parts and how they're assembled, I was like, oh, it's okay for me to make a simple thing where people bring their own interpretation. That's part of the fun, you know? I shouldn't tweak every little pixel and make it exactly this way or that way, because then I take all the fun of anybody interpreting this in their own way. And I'm telling them what the game is, and they're like, nobody's going to want to play that. They're like, well, that's Jeff's game. You know, like, I just wanted to blow some shit up for a few hours, you know?
Well, so going back to the old games, the one thing I always remember is how, and this is almost like even like VHS direct-to-video movies, right? The images on the box. How much do you think that potentially like flavored things? Like, it's like album covers, right? Some album covers are so iconic, or, you know, have like a certain amount of mythology around them that, you know, again, if you put the record on, it's like, you're not looking at the cover of Master of Puppets when, you know, you're playing Orion, right? But almost everybody who listens to that song can see that album cover right away. So, you know, like for Choplifter, like, do you think that any of that sort of stuff helped play into what you brought to it?
For sure. I mean, everything that was going on at that age for me, all the other media I was watching, A-Team, all the sort of like, if I saw it now, I'd be like, oh, this is semi-propagandistic, very Americanish stuff. But it was also super campy, you know, and whatever. So yeah, I think the Choplifter example, it wasn't just Choplifter, it was Choplifter plus everything else that I thought was cool, is actually what made Choplifter really fun. But I think that made me realize that when I was doing something creative, all I had to do was do something that made me happy and connect it to just enough of what other people are experiencing right now that it'll click with people. Like if I tell people it exists, if I tell enough people that it's out there, like a community will start to form around it a little bit. Whereas before I thought I had to be Beethoven before I was even worthy of doing anything artistic. You know, I thought I had to be up at that level, which is why I think I spent so much time on technique. Because I thought it was about how good you were at assembling the parts. It wasn't until much later when I was like, no, it's about what you do with the parts, you know? And I know that's cliche and people say that and it seems obvious, but it's very different when you're in the weeds and you're like seeing all your own flaws, judging your own work, all the stuff. And like, you forget to come up for air and just be like, yeah, why did I start doing this, by the way? Like, where's all the joy that's supposed to be here?
Yeah. I mean, like you said, that even as a developer, right, there's a difference between debugging software and then actually using it. The experiences are almost wholly different, even if the person is using the same interface. Because like, to your point, bringing things to video games, it's like bringing things to music, right? Where I can see a band, you can say that their recorded album isn't anywhere close to their live show. Their live show means something to you because of the age you were at when you saw it, the venue it was at, the people you were with, the night you went out and saw them, right? Like all of those aspects, you're like, well, why do I like this band? It's like, because one of the best days my buddies and I ever had was going to see this band and, you know, this whole experience here, right? And you could then like ship that album to a friend and even put it on. You could be sitting in front of them and you have that horrible look on your face where you're like projecting. It's like, okay, you need to love this instantaneously as much as I love it for all of these reasons that aren't actually present on this piece of, you know, plastic.
Yeah. Another example of that is my wife, Paula, and I have been watching, like taking turns picking a movie. We'll like watch a movie together. But I've been going down this like, oh, I need to expose Paula to this, like these 80s movies I love. And one of the movies we watched is Predator. And I was like, I haven't seen this thing in 25 years, you know, and it was like I just remember this being amazing, you know. And we watch it and I see her not being a 7-year-old boy in the 80s seeing Predator for the first time. And she's like, okay. One of her critiques was, I really preferred Bruce Willis. He's funnier. I was like, yeah, Predator does kind of try to take itself a little seriously, you know, like what if aliens really came to the Earth? We had to fight against them, you know? And it demystified like all those like Schwarzenegger movies, just a little bit. And I was like, oh, I'm seeing this movie for the first time through the eyes of somebody who doesn't give a shit about all the action movies in the 80s, you know? And she's just like, this is less funny than Die Hard. Can we just watch Die Hard again?
Yeah, and you're not just like she's not surrounded by people yelling out, run, go, get to the chopper.
Exactly.
Ain't got time to bleed. Just like, because there's so many things out those movies, right? Where it is because of the culture of, I saw this movie by myself. I didn't really care for it. But once my friends and I, we all started just quoting it endlessly. You almost can appreciate it. It's sometimes like, I think of a movie like, what is it? The Big Sleep, which is a classic noir movie starring Humphrey Bogart that everybody says has a completely incomprehensible plot. But they say it's one of the best noir movies of all time, not because of the plot, which is what you think like a noir should be. It's like, oh, it should be a detective. And it's like a detective story. It's like, yes, it is. Don't follow that. You are watching it because it's the interactions between him and the femme fatale and the bad guys and the aesthetic of it and all of these sort of things. So you almost need to watch the movie once. Be like, okay, I've seen the movie. I generally know the beats of it. So now the next time I watch it, I can completely ignore the plot. And my brain won't just be trying to like, wait, I need to follow what's going along and all these sorts of people. It's like, yeah, I know there's like all these people around it. And you can, only upon second viewing can you actually really enjoy it that way.
Have you seen Eraserhead?
Yes.
I figure like you're so into movies compared to me. I feel like anything I've seen, you've seen, and then like times 10 other things. I've only seen it twice. I saw it once in my first marriage when we were talking about maybe having kids, but I was starting to realize I really didn't want to have kids. And it just terrified the shit out of me. It like perfectly described everything I feared about potentially being a father in that film. And I was like, whoa. And I had no idea like how deep-seated that fear was. And maybe it was that movie that clinched it. I don't know. But then I watched the movie again just like a couple of weeks ago. And it was even more terrifying, even though that decision, the decision that made it terrifying the first time is no longer in front of me. But I was seeing just the more of the way the film was made, more of the feeling, more of the torture the characters were going through. And I just like, it almost made me ill. I was just like, God, this is such a like an emotionally intense movie. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've had that experience watching, I think like a classic one is the National Lampoon Vacation movies. As you get older, you start off, like, wow, my father is so much like Clark Griswold. And then as you get older, you're like, I so associate with Clark Griswold in this movie, where things that are unspoken, where it's like dad is doing weird stuff versus where you're like, I understand what he's trying to accomplish and failing horribly at and what that feeling is like. Yeah, I definitely, and so it's strange, that you have those sorts of movies. I know there was one recently, Drive My Car or whatever. It was the Japanese Academy Award nominee for Best Foreign Picture a couple of years ago. It's like a 3-hour-long movie, stuff like that. It's based upon this Murakami novel and stuff. I don't know, there was something like very affecting about this. And it is one of those things that I realized that I was there with a friend of mine. And for her, the movie absolutely didn't hit any of those moments. And she was like, the movie was way too long. I couldn't stand it. And I'm there and I'm having like this emotional experience. And I'm like, I don't know what to, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's like, this is a movie where it hit me on this sort of very, how precarious the characters' experiences were in this film versus for her that, I know in film, there's that quality of like, is this emotion earned or not? And for her, the film had not earned the emotion, while for me, it had totally earned it. Right. And again, I think it's ironic that your wife mentioned Bruce Willis because, both of those movies were made by the same director, right? John McTiernan.
Were they really? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, Die Hard and Predator. So, yeah. So, I know, I kind of had the same touch on both of those and stuff. So, I don't know.
So when Paul and I first got together, one of the things she mentioned is she likes a good, like, kind of mindless action movie. She also loves, like, excellent writing and Aaron Sorkin and stuff like that, really challenging stuff. Really character-driven stuff, but once in a while, she just wants some candy in the form of just like a mindless, funny movie. But when I first heard that, I was like, oh, cool. I like action movies. Yeah. But then I realized, like, when she started saying things like, this movie isn't funny enough, I'm like, it's an action movie. She's like, oh, yeah, but I don't really like action movies for the action. I like them when they don't take themselves very seriously. I was like, oh, I like Rocky 4 when he's like taking this as this like a life death struggle between him and Drago, you know?
Drago! And if I can change, and you can change. Yeah, and I mean, you're like, and then, he gets Gorbachev to do the standing ovation. Yeah, I mean, come on, right?
I forgot about that. Yeah. Or like Bloodsport, right?
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Like all those Van Damme movies, like take themselves super seriously. Bloodsport's a great example, but like I watched that with Paul as well. It's just like, is the fighting over yet? I'm like, but this is his triumphant moments, you know? And she's like, I don't care. These are one-dimensional cardboard characters. And I'm like, yeah, but they're so cool. She's like, not really.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. Now I'm trying to think of like what are like good, absolutely funny action movies, right? I mean, because a part of me is when you describe that, I think of, again, going back to the 80s, like a lot of canon films, right? So you're talking about the Delta Force movies, right? Missing in Action, the Ninja trilogy, right? Enter the Ninja, Return of the Ninja, Ninja 3, Domination. And all of these films are funny, but they're also funny unintentionally, right? Like Ninja 3, where she is a telephone technician / aerobics instructor with an arcade machine in her apartment that goes crazy because the sword that she found is possessed by the spirit of a ninja, right? And then it starts taking over her body.
Obviously.
Yeah. And it's like, so, okay, this movie is completely ridiculous. And so I love it, but it isn't intentionally funny, right? I mean, in any that sort of way. And so sometimes people will be like, okay, you want me to laugh at this movie? I have to have something to hold on first too before I actually want to do that. And for me, I've realized it's like, well, yeah, you need to be an 8-year-old boy who loves ninjas.
Right.
Right. And that will carry you through this movie forever.
Like back to your point about like you had to be a certain person at a certain time in life with certain experiences for this to really matter to you, you know?
Oh, yeah. Well, because like a good example is like I was back in Ohio, where I'm from originally, went to a concert with my brother and my nephew. He's 13, really takes after his father and really loves like heavy metal and these things. So we went to the Static X, Seven Dust, Dope, Lines of Loyalty show stuff. Classic, like late 90s metal gig and stuff. And for me, I was like, I probably wouldn't listen to this music now, but I'm loving being here with them, right? They're really enjoying it. There's aspects of these bands that I remember from being that age, right? And like it clicks that nostalgia aspect of it. So again, sort of like I said, watching The Big Sleep, where I'm like, I don't really care about what is even going on musically. It's like just it being what I wanted, like nostalgia is just like hitting that dopamine sort of rush. And it's like, I feel that hitting me. And then again, being there with them and doing this whole experience with him, it's like he's doing some of his first concerts, right? And he's really, really entered to it and stuff. And I don't know, they've merely made this a thing. And so, but I really, really enjoyed it. But it's, again, if I told even my friends right now, it's like, hey, dude, we should totally do it when they come here to Chicago, stuff like that. They'd be like, why? It's like they wouldn't understand it. And then especially like taking my wife, Michelle, right? It's like, hey, you love concerts. This was the concert that we saw in Cleveland. We should totally go. She's like, why are we here? It's like, okay, you had to be a teenager in the 90s in Ohio listening to radio, and you would hear these bands all the time, right?
Yeah, totally. I just watched like a thing about Rob Zombie recently and how he was more of an art school visual guy.
Oh, yeah.
And then he was like describing a couple of their early videos, music videos they made for their first album, and why they're so frenetic and visual and stuff. And how he's like, well, I don't know, I want to start a band, but he wanted to do all this other visual art stuff, which I guess is part of how he wound up doing movies and that kind of thing. We first knew him for White Zombie, the band, right? And I remember that in junior high, I had this friend that was really, like, he was like the guy in the group kind of introducing everybody else to the cool stuff. I remember that band just seemed like, oh, so hard and so edgy. And it's funny to come back now and you see these artists grown up and they talk about, they're like, oh, really? I was trying to do this artistic visual thing. And you're like, oh, I was just really into rock music, you know?
Oh, yeah. Well, and even some of those things where you're like, oh, White Zombie, that's like a cool, tough name and stuff like that. And then you learn it's like, actually, it's based upon this old movie. Like, okay, well, like the Misfits are kind of like based upon an old movie, right? And stuff and blah, blah, blah. And then you realize somebody like Rob Zombie, it's like, no, he is really into these like old B movies. And this is a very intentional choice as to why he did it. Mm-hmm. And now you suddenly get older. And I mean, that's one thing that I've started doing is watching a lot of these older films. And I can't remember, I think White Zombie might be a Boris Karloff movie stuff. It's and then because it makes me think of this movie, I Walk with a Zombie, it's done by this director, Jacques Tourneur, who Martin Scorsese is like, oh, is like this great underrated B movie director. He did like I Walk with a Zombie, Cat People, all the like Leopard Man and stuff like that. These really great, super noirish, low budget, but look like $1 million films and stuff. And very, very effective and really, really well done. And I don't know, again, this is the sort of conversation that probably Rob Zombie would be like absolutely wanting to talk about Jacques Tourneur and all these old movies and stuff like that. But then, of course, when I was 15, it's like, yeah, man, this slays. This is so heavy. This is heavier than these other bands, right? At this point, he's probably sitting there. He's like, can I talk to somebody about some movies or something? Again, you only realize this later on, right? And you look back, you're like, oh yeah, this is maybe a little meat-headed, but oh well,
Yeah, the way you envision the people you admire at certain ages, it turns out you don't really know much about them personally, but how that affects the way you interpret their art, both before and after you find out more about who they really are, is a really fascinating process. Like going back to kind of the curiosity thing I was talking about before, I'm very driven in a lot of things. I want to know how things work, but I also want to know how people tick. And I want to know, how did this person grow up? Why did they make that decision? How did they come to this worldview that they have?
Yeah. Well, and it becomes, I know, like you said, that what we bring to art, I don't view that as a bad thing at all. I think that that's absolutely necessary.
We as the viewers.
Yeah. As, I don't want to say consumers of, but the audience for the art, that while we aren't participating, it is still a two-way process. Again, I think music is definitely that way, right? Like definitely in the DIY punk rock scene, right? Where it's like, listen, I know that you guys aren't making a lot of money, so this is probably in somebody's basement. You're probably sleeping on somebody's couch, right? Somebody probably might make you a dinner for free, right? All of this. And so I can spend $5 to watch like 10 bands play, right? And so it's more than just like a very one directional thing. And so that, I do think the box art and commercials and advertising and the community around video games is absolutely appropriate. And again, the same thing like for when it comes to music, where it's like learning more about the musicians, how they actually created it. It colors the artwork in a way that is important. And sometimes I think that it's like, no, an artwork should be able to be something that you take purely on its own merits. It's worthwhile to look at artwork that way, but no artwork is made in that vacuum.
All right, John. So getting all the way, kind of wrapping this up here.
Yeah, sure.
How do you see the balance you have right now between just like responsibilities, work, career, stuff like that, and these creative outlets for you? And why is whatever balance you have, why is it the way it is right now?
So I would say that it, again, really comes down to community. Probably attending music is my biggest activity, mostly because I have a large brotherhood here, I would say. Who go to music, talk about music, go to shows. I already have 20 concerts lined up for the rest of the year, and I know I'm going to do far more than that. I've only gone to, I could bring up my spreadsheet, right? I keep all the track of all this stuff, not only the concerts I go to, but did I pay for them or not? Were they free or not? Did somebody else buy tickets? Who actually attended? I actually keep track of like literally who this growing list of people I actually attend things is. But yeah, I probably have 20 going up. I'm already planning on going to LA in May to go and see Duran Duran and Heaven 17 at Cruel World Fest, right? Yeah, and it comes down to all of the people. When it comes to the other artistic work I have, I don't know. Yeah, the community is much smaller. I have like one or two friends who kind of do similar things. Like I said, that they're musicians of various kinds or they do this other sort of stuff. I think I probably would need to set bigger goals around it. For concerts, there's always the classic one of trying to do at least 52 in a year, hit at least one concert a week, right? That's kind of a basic goal. Breaking 100 is usually considered like a good number. Doing 104 at least in a year is like, okay, now you're doing 2 a week. That's like a very, very solid number. The most I've done is 118. And so again, like just kind of having that metric really helps push it. I even have friends there where they always talk about their year-end list. What are going to be the best concerts of the year? What are the best albums? In the middle of the year, you're like, oh, is this going to crack my top 10 or not? Or is this going to move down? Having those types of metrics are really, really useful, right? Because it just, again, it provides that conversation, the fluid that even while we're not doing it, it helps carry us from one event to the next. So I don't know. Yeah, I need to find that similar sort of thing for these other artistic outlets, right? Otherwise I don't want to say languish as just hobbies, but they shouldn't just be sort of idle things to pass the time, right? I think that when anybody does this sort of work, I would want them to be able to do it where it's something where they can take pleasure in sharing it with somebody, where if somebody hears something or sees something that you've created, and like I said, that experience of somebody saying, oh, that's great, you made that you take pride in that, right? It's like what I've presented to the world, when it's accepted, I take immense joy in it.
All right, now I'm just trying to think of an ending.
Well, I appreciate you bringing me over for your podcast here and stuff.
Yeah, man. Thanks for joining. It's been a lot of fun. We'll have to do it again for sure.
No, totally. Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, I have all sorts of insipid opinions on things and stuff like that. So yeah, as long as you're enjoying it and hopefully somebody else out there enjoyed it too, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, for sure, man. All right.
Peace.
This has been the Wilderness and the Wellspring podcast. You can find me on the service previously known as Twitter under the username @JeffLuntGames. You can also find me on Substack at wildernessandwellspring.substack.com. I want to thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.